Chris O'Connor here. Join our prestigious curmudgeonly community on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/curmudgeonrock. Also be on the lookout for a Spotify playlist dedicated to this episode. Now let's get started.
This is the Curmudgeon Rock Report, and this is your podcast made by rock geek iconoclastic outsiders for rock geek iconoclastic outsiders. For those of you who lament that rock music has gone the way of jazz and slipped into niche genre status, we are here to keep that flame alive by providing insight, analysis, recommendations, and honest takes, not hot takes. And hey, there's a good chance you'll learn some rock history you never knew before. We'll be talking about the hip-hop origin story on this episode. The timing, of course, is not coincidental. You probably noticed quite a bit of press coverage this month about the 50th anniversary of hip-hop. And you may have read about a number of events planned to commemorate the Big 5-0. Yo. That coverage focuses on one moment in time in particular, a party in the rec room of an apartment building in the West Bronx and DJ'd by the legendary Kool Herc, held August 11th, 1973. Well, Herc debuted a new souped-up sound system at this party. That indeed was a significant milestone. Much like the dance halls of Herc's native Jamaica, the DJ with the sound system ruled the roost. But Herc did not really invent hip-hop on that specific day. And the apparent need to pin a start date on the dominant musical idiom of our time cheapens the greater narrative in our curmudgeonly and correct worldview. So let's meditate a bit on the formation of hip-hop culture for the next 90 minutes or so, shall we? Before there was Drake and auto-tune, before Tupac and Biggie, before Run DMC, there was the South Bronx of New York City of the 1970s. Arguably, no other genre of music is as tied to a super specific time and place as much as hip-hop. By 1970, 2 decades of raised highway construction, redlining, and the migration of the middle class to all points north had created an American tragedy. The systemic impoverishment and degradation of an entire neighborhood. In the very early 1970s, legitimate gang warfare broke out in the Bronx. So too did a longing for peaceful harmony over destruction, though. The gangs eventually called a truce in 1971, but the drugs and crime went nowhere. Neither did that longing for community and transcendence. And that's the context in which hip-hop gestated. Cold rock in a party for young people, including a wave of immigrants from Jamaica and all other Caribbean countries, became the competitive sport in place of gang life. The supremacy of the DJ, the MC's ability to hype the crowd and verbally beat the crap out of his peers, the fierce popping and locking of the b-boy dancers, the fresh style and territorial anarchy of graffiti. It all mattered. Doing it better than your opponent was the whole point of hip-hop's culture. That fire was the central source of hip-hop's evolution, and it still is today. On this episode, we'll discuss why hip-hop's origins are so unique. Why is it easier to connect dots between Flo Milli and Afrika Bambaataa than it is to connect the dots between Death Valley Girls and Big Mama Thornton? We'll explain. We'll also marvel at the 4 elements of hip-hop, namely the DJ, MCing, breakdancing, and graffiti, and celebrate hip-hop's forefathers, which, beside Herc and Bambaataa, include Grandmaster Flash and Grandmaster Caz. And we'll examine the end of the Innocents, when the Sugar Hill Gang's Rapper's Delight broke through on the radio and positioned hip-hop as an explosive export from the Bronx to your own neighborhood and beyond. Now, allow us to let author and hip-hop historian Jeff Chang kick us off with his own gorgeous meditation on the evolution and the revolution that is hip-hop. Quote, "The new culture seemed to whirl backward and forward. A loop of history, history as a loop, calling and responding, leaping, spinning, renewing. In the loop, there is the alpha, the omega, and the turning points in between. The scene disappears, slips into endless motion, and reveals a new logic, the circumference of a worldview." Welcome to the Curmudgeon Rock Report.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Bronx is burning. Sadly, that was definitely a truth, a sad truth of the 1970s for the Bronx. However, there was another ancillary fire that was burning just as hotly or as brightly at the time, and that is what we're talking about in this episode, and it is the birth and the origins of what eventually became known as hip hop. Arturo, this should be an interesting discussion.
It is. This is a pure history episode. And these are some of my favorites to do because of all the detail and the research and the information. And just the fact, just share stuff with people, share information that educate people, I guess, but also share information that needs to be known as well. And hip hop, it's the 50th anniversary of the supposed birth of hip hop on that specific day of 1973. Yeah. But at the same time, people need to know like how unique and special this genre of music was when it started. There was really nothing else like it in the world.
With that said, where else hip hop is a good thing and a big thing, right?
In the parallel universe.
Yeah, right? Absolutely. And yes, you got that right. You won a car. We're now traveling over into the parallel universe, that wonderful rip in the space-time continuum where we get to leave this world and its bad tastes and social media madness, and we get to go back to a simpler time when rock actually rocked and was on the billboards and on the radio and on the cover of Rolling Stone, and they sold out the stadiums, and rock was the thing, man. Well, in the parallel universe, it still is. Long way of saying that if it was up to us, the world would be structured so that the artists and songs and bands that we cover in this segment of our show, the parallel universe, would be front and center. And one thing that I think you have to say about the regular universe, I think one truism is that if you're a woman in rock and roll in your 50s, the world is not terribly kind to you as far as exposure and as far as reverence. But you are here to correct that record on this episode, aren't you?
Yes, the album I'm talking about that came out this year by PJ Harvey, I Inside the Old Year Dime. Now, you may be wondering why an artist with such a big name as PJ Harvey's is being featured in our Parallel Universe segment, which is supposed to feature artists that, in a parallel universe where rock music is still a pop cultural force, should be huge. Let me explain. For an exactly 20-year span, from 1992 to 2011, one Polly Jean Harvey produced one of the richest, most adventurous, most consistently brilliant, and most challenging discographies / catalogs in rock and pop history. The woman is a legend and is more than deserving of all the critical accolades she has received for all these years. I understand that the Netflix streaming series Stranger Things reignited an interest in Kate Bush and, let's be honest, It was the main reason and the impetus to getting her inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame this year.
Yeah, pretty much.
Thank you, Stranger Things.
Yep.
But as far as solo female visionary British artists whose music truly endures, PJ Harvey goes up to Kate Bush and tells her, "Hold my beer." So in our parallel universe, PJ Harvey's PJ Harvey's commercial success, which unfortunately in our real universe has always been modest at best. In our parallel universe, she would be massive and Madonna level huge, and she'd already be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. That's how I justify PJ Harvey being in our parallel universe segment.
There you go.
To her new album, and first in 7 years, I Inside the Old Year Dying. Musically, she seems to have gone back to the slightly subtly electronic textures that underlined her very underrated 1998 album, Is This Desire, except slowed way down with all kinds of space opened up. This approach makes sense because lyrically, she's drawing on the mysticism and the mystique of traditional English folk music. She has flirted with this before, particularly on 2007's White Chalk, and took it to a subversive level on 2011's Let England Shake. Lyrically, she goes full-on English folk here, but this is no pastiche. This is PJ Harvey we're talking about here, and this is the lyrical tropes of English folk put through a classic PJ Harvey prism, meaning the end result is surreal and unsettling. Now, is the album any good? Well, like most albums that have come out this year, it's hit and miss. It really hits toward the end with the eerie, foreboding, ambient dread of A Child's Question, July, where Harvey goes on about horny devils and goaty gods. The final track, A Noiseless Noise, is the closest thing to a rock song, where Polly whips out her electric guitar and rides an intense tribal rhythm that unsettles rather than grooves, in a good way, of course. Unfortunately, there are 3 or 4 tracks that meander a little too much into ambient nothingness. Nevertheless, it's a solid record that finds PJ Harvey aging in new and interesting ways. If anything, hopefully this album will turn newcomers on to the wonders and the brilliance of Miss Harvey's back catalog. Chris?
Perhaps. You're right. It is a kind of a strange record in terms of like that slowed down, stretched out folk influence and the electronica. But it goes deeper than that. And in looking at this a little bit, so she, PJ Harvey, she wrote a very long lyrical poem called Orlam. And this was released in 2022. And this album is based in large part on that poem. Getting this from the review in allmusic.com, quote, "The album expands on Orlam, her epic poem about the coming of age of Ira Abel, a young Dorset girl whose companions include the bleeding ghostly soldier Wyman Elvis and Orlam itself, a lamb's eyeball that serves as the village's oracle." End quote. So this is like very traditional, mystical, it's a mythology. It's like her own, it's her own mythology, but steeped in traditional folk mythology, sort of like folk tales from that region. And I guess, she leans heavily on that dialect, even in the lyrics of that Dorset region. And so she's getting very, very, very artsy. And so the one thing I could say is that this is a good album for her to release and as an established legend or an established arena act in the parallel universe. If it was her first one out of the gate, she might be in a little bit of trouble because it's a little bit eclectic. And so it's a long way from Dry and To Bring You My Love. And Rid of Me. But it's I said it's pretty good. I can see it growing on me. You're right. The end of the record, Noiseless Noise, especially makes me. It naturally the best song on the album is the one that sounds the most like PJ Harvey. Uh, but I could see this one growing on me because of its ambitions, and because, you know, she's working with the same people she has for years. I mean, it's Flood, it's John Parrish, it's all the usual folks. And so if it all sounds kind of familiar in a way, the sort of the deep engineering and that sort of, you know, she's really underrated as a guitarist, isn't she?
Yeah, really is. Always has been.
Yeah, really, she just a lot of contours and a lot of depth to what she does with the guitar. So I think she maintains that on this record for sure. So now we go back to we do more traditional parallel universe things where,
and this is just this, and here we're just going to talk about a song.
Yes, we're talking about a song, but we're going more traditional in the sense that these are a bunch of young guys from Leeds, England. The band here is Yard Act.
We've covered them before.
Yes, we have. If Yard Act sounds familiar, it was because their debut album from last year, The Overload, placed quite high on both of our best of year-end lists for 2022. It actually came in at number 2 on my list. I thought it was a brilliant record. And this band, they're really, really clever in the sense that the influences and the appropriations are obvious in terms of the reverence, but they do it in a way that it gets its own edge and its own sort of rhythmic texture and flavor, and it has an unusual sensuality which really lends itself because of the lead singer and rapper of this band is a guy named James Smith.
He doesn't really rap. He just does spoken word.
It's like a spoken word, but he approaches rap in some cases, like and especially like on this song, you can get away with calling it like rap in the sort of the streets Eminem, sort of more Saul Williams sense.
Yeah.
So this song, it was released just recently in the last couple of months. It's called The Trenchcoat Museum, and it's really exciting because it portends more new music by this band in the near future. So this song,
by the way, I read about it on the NME's website. It's a standalone single that will not be on their next album.
Huh. Okay.
Yep.
Well, that's good to know. As standalone singles goes, this one kicks ass.
It sure does. Yeah.
It is 8 minutes and 11 seconds of just raw, pure energy and groove. They basically take the formula that they established on The Overload and they turn the knobs all the way up to about 16. And it's pure energy and groove and cheeky fun. It manages, and this is a neat trick to kind of gives you the territory that they're working in. They kind of take the kitschy cowbell disco of LCD sound system, the hypnotic propulsion of the Clash's Magnificent Seven, the organized noise collage of the Adrian Belew era Talking Heads, and the manic, uncontainable energy of the Prodigy's Firestarter. Now, you know, it gives you an idea of the kind of pace, the kind of groove, the kind of energy, and just the kind of just plain old fun that they're having with this song. And it continues to stretch and grow, and it gets more hypnotic, and it gets more energetic, and it gets more flavorful as it goes along. And it's kind of it's in a way, it's a funny song because it accompanies Smith. He has a clever riff in there on the trench coat, the history of the trench coat, and its various cultural associations. You know, dapper on the town scenester, upper crust aristocrat, and stone cold fascist leader.
Yeah, it's basically it's kind of a funny, weird. I don't know, not weird, but it's a clever. I don't want to say meditation, but it's a clever commentary on the desperate male ego.
In a way, like why else would anybody wear a coat that goes all the way down to the floor and be inconvenient? It's basically the swinging dick, and there's a lot of context for that, which he kind of covers, and so it's very cheeky, and very fun, and so you get this crazily leather jacket and spandex evoking musical arrangement, and it's a song about swanky and or menacing trench coats. And so it's a really cute, hilarious juxtaposition that makes this song all the more delectable. Strongly enthusiastic recommendation for this song, folks. Go seek it out. The video actually is available on YouTube, and that's a lot of fun too. Just think about like how much you can get out of a party with trench coats, and it's a lot of fun. And so again, the Trench Coat Museum, name of the band is Yard Act. They're one of the best new bands in the world. I'm a huge fan, indeed. Chris here again. We usually end our episodes by inviting you to join our Curmudgeonly community page on Facebook. Well, we're picking up our efforts there. Know people just as passionate as us about rock and roll? Invite them to join in the fun. You don't actually need our permission to do so. Also, expect to see a lot more content up there moving forward. Our mission is to engage you, so darn it, we'll engage you like a fire hose. Or maybe like a firehouse, if we're going to give love to Gene Simmons. We may also be making a few offers. Want to wear a t-shirt featuring our logo? You may have that opportunity soon. So be a fellow curmudgeon, help us expand our little community, and share your own musings via your own posts. We're at facebook.com/groups/curmudgeonrock.
So basically, the 20th century marks the point where American music basically took over the world. In the 20th century, you had the genres of blues, jazz, country music, which has its roots in English folk, but whatever, rhythm and blues, which became eventually R&B, soul, rock and roll, funk. All of that came out in the 20th century, all came from America, and all got adopted and adapted by different cultures throughout the world, and they were all given their own unique flavor and spin. Well, and let's not forget electronic music also, which really a lot of people would say, oh, Europe and all those countries. Oh, the United States had a lot to do with electronica. Yeah, Detroit techno and Chicago house. But anyway, you could argue that the last American genre that really had a major worldwide lasting impact were two. All that electronica that came out in the 1980s, and of course, hip hop, arguably the last truly important American genre. And
absolutely,
like we said, it unlike a lot of the other genres that had different areas. You know, the blues, it wasn't just Mississippi. You had blues in Louisiana. You had blues in Alabama. You had blues in different parts. Rhythm and blues was scattered all throughout the South. The northern industrial cities, that's where the rhythm and blues came from and got put back down into the South. Country music spread through several states and had the origins in different states all along or near Appalachia. Hip hop, no. Hip hop, its origins is really in one part of one city, the Bronx, New York.
Yes, and so that's kind of the fascinating thing about it is it's a hyper local movement, and well, I mean, let's just start off. I mean, we have 4 points to make about what makes the birth of hip hop so unique, and the first one to really to make a point of, and we kind of we've hinted at this. The first one is that it's a cultural invention as much as it is a musical one. Yeah, and by that, at this time, think about it. What happens when no one's looking? Really, there's when we think of hip hop today, we think of it as very commoditized. You've got the formats, you've got singles, you've got videos, you've got influences, you've got things to aspire to. You're making a product for people to consume. At the time that hip hop starts to gestate, there is no industry, there is no product, there's not even radio outlet for it. There's no, hey, I want to be, at least Elvis could be like, hey, I want to be like the old blues singers, or I want to be like Big Mama Thornton. Right. No, there wasn't even an aspiration. And so the culture This was not a let's make music ambition racket. This was a uh, let's put the party and the performance. It's let's have a
right.
party and let's put on the performances. And
Yeah.
there's nothing really, so in that sense, there's nothing really linear about it. It just kind of comes from folks figuring out their way through where they were in at that time and in that place in history. And so
Yeah.
there was no blueprint for how to make a product out of vinyl records, sound systems, turntables, microphones, spray paint, and basically your body, with dance offs. I mean,
Yeah.
it by its own nature, hip hop is a very industrial creation.
Mhm.
It's the byproduct of stuff that was in your environment. It is just kind
Right.
of in a way,
You make do with what you got.
yeah. And when you ain't got much, and what they had was music.
Yeah, and
And
that's
what
what I wanted to get at because you mentioned
Yes,
the cultural part of it.
yes,
An important, if not maybe the most important aspect of this cultural notion of hip hop, it came from the desperation of impoverished inner city youth. And that desperation wasn't, well, yeah, okay, they want to make money, of course, but that desperation, a desperation to be heard, a desperation for them to define themselves in a
yep,
world that wouldn't help them at all.
yeah,
And
absolutely,
that's what hip hop came from, that desperation. I am
yeah,
here. This is me. Look at me. I am something. I mean something. I
yes,
have something to give to the world. And in a world that, in an environment where these young people came from, where they were rejected, ostracized, marginalized, disenfranchised. And yeah, hip hop did come from that.
yes, absolutely. And it comes from a celebration, but it runs a little deeper than that. Let's get into that now. I mean, in terms of our second point of what
Yeah.
makes this so unique, and you alluded to it, that this was a hyper local, hyper terrestrial movement. And Jeff Chang, who we quoted in the opener, brilliant writer and author and historian, has a book that he released in 2005. And one thing about history is it never goes out of style. So it is not an aged out book. It's called "Can't Stop, Won't Stop," and strongly recommend that you buy that from your local record store or from thrift books or anywhere besides Amazon. Uh, and he makes the point that if you drew a 7 mile circle from the center of the Bronx, that's where most of the hip hop innovation between like 1972, 73, and 1978 was happening. Before, and it eventually started to make its way out to the other boroughs in the tri-state area, the other boroughs, and out to Jersey and things like that. But it was all part of this Bronx, and really the southern half of the Bronx is where all this was. And now, why is that important? Now, most people our age and even younger still, when you hear people talk about the Bronx or the South Bronx, we're not talking about a very positive thing, are we, Art?
No, I mean, this
No.
1970s in New York, I mean, especially in these parts of New
Yeah.
York, there was a lot of crime. There was
Yeah.
a lot of
Oh,
like I said, disenfranchisement as well. But there was
it
a lot of crime, and there were a lot of problems, drugs,
yeah,
gangs, you know.
absolutely. But it ran deeper than that. It was a systemic creation. It's one of the most disgraceful things ever to happen. Basically, when we talk about uh, kind of enforced poverty, like
Hmm.
enforced concentrated
Yeah.
poverty, South Bronx is a euphemism for that, and that was a product of several decades of happenings. You had the construction of the Cross Bronx Expressway, the good old
Hmm.
CBE, which is one of the
Yeah.
worst highways in the world. Uh, it raised highways. So basically, what you do is you put a raised highway and you rip it down the middle of the neighborhood. Well, if you can move away from it, you can. If not, well, now you're living in the shadows of a big ass highway,
Right.
and so that is something that happens. There's the discriminatory practice of redlining in terms of property values going down, and that's pretty much related to the industrialization up there. You had widespread slumlording. So the idea is once the property values start going down, now these folks are like, oh shoot, we're stuck, and here comes the crime, here comes the poverty, and we're not going to take care of our buildings. Which by the mid 70s, I made a reference to it at the beginning. The Bronx is burning. Yes, it was. It was there was just terrible arson that went on. Like here's a stat I got from the New York Post. At one point in the Bronx, 7 different census tracts in the Bronx lost more than 97% of their buildings to fire and abandonment in the 70s, and 44 tracts, which is basically like about a fourth or maybe a fifth of the Bronx, lost more than 50% of its buildings. So you have that. For about a 4-year period, you had severe gang warfare that went on in the late 60s and early 70s. And that's an important point because it was from the gang violence and the crime and all of this terrible stuff going on and this competitive, like, if this is a place where everybody's abandoning, now it's this sort of nihilistic tribalism, war for control of territory, of turf. Right. And so you had that until there was a truce in the early 70s. But from that, obviously the crime didn't go anywhere, the poverty didn't go anywhere. There was heroin all over the place too. And so, and with all these burning buildings, all these dilapidated buildings, all that, I mean, it looked like a third world country. If you've ever seen pictures of parts of the Bronx, it was not a pleasant place to be. And so if there was ever a neighborhood on this planet that was in need of transcendence, it was this tragic man-made shithole. And for a lot of people, Chang's sources make the point in his book, and I've seen this talked about elsewhere. It really truly was a matter of life or death, whether you attended these parties that sprung up in the Bronx or not. If you were to, if you became a b-boy, if you became a DJ or an MC, or if you were just hanging out, you attended the party and were just cold rocking and just like hanging out, just being associated with these parties, if you weren't doing that, maybe you were off getting high or stealing or robbing or killing. Right. So it really was kind of a life or death thing. And so from that, like you said, part of it was that having that self-confidence in the midst of all of this and saying, hey, I am somebody. But there's also that competitiveness. And that's the third point that we're going to segue into, that hip hop was not really about the, individual, I'm here to perform a song, I'm here to write a song, or artistic expression. It was more akin to, there was the artistic expression, but it was more akin to a competitive sport. Right. You were really, it wasn't just general or, media shaped rebellion. There was nothing prefab here. It was, think of it like cage fighting, but with mics and turntables. Yeah. And, this is where what we'll talk about here in a bit, that the 4 elements come in. You've got DJing, who had the best records in their crates, who could bust out the best breaks, who could hype up the crowd the most, who could keep them dancing, who can keep them, who can come out with the biggest surprises, those types of things, who could, do the turntables the best, who could lead the party. You had MCing, who had the freshest rhymes and who hyped the crowd the most, and, who could like really like lead the party. And, you had rapping, you ended up with MCing crews, and this is where battle rapping would come from. Breakdancing, who busted out the best moves, who was the most aggressive. I mean, hip hop dancing, it didn't start off as backspinning. It was basically popping and locking and like just crazy kicking out of feet and hands. And it also has origins in gang warfare too. It was like kind of like ceremonial dances before you got to the real fight. And then graffiti, which was probably the most anarchic of the 4. It was like legitimately like we're claiming ownership of everything that we can put something on, whether it's a bridge, whether it's a wall, whether it's your car, whether it's your mom, we're going to do that. And here's a great quote. And again, this comes from Jeff Chang's book, Can't Stop, Won't Stop. He interviews DJ Jazzy J, and he talks about where a lot of this came from and how it was. He says, quote, instead of gangs, they started turning into little area crews where they would do a little bit of dirt. In every area, there would be a DJ crew or a breakdance crew. They would be like, okay, we are all about our music and we love our music, but you come to this area wrong and we're all about kicking your ass. Competition fueled the whole thing.
Yeah. I want to mention something about the competition. A long time ago, back in 1996, Nick Cave, the artist, Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, was nominated by MTV for some video music award. I think it was Best Male Vocalist or something like that. I forgot what it was. But anyway, Nick Cave then wrote an open letter to MTV, first thanking them for thinking of him and nominating him because, he never sold records in America. But ultimately, he declined the nomination, refused to accept it. And his main reason for that was because he didn't like the idea of music or any kind of music being put within the context of competition, because he thought competition, in his words, was not something that his muse reacted to very well. I'm paraphrasing. Well, and when you read a letter like that, it kind of reeks of white privilege.
Yes, it does.
This is a white, middle class, almost middle-aged white people just not understanding, and it's a reason why a lot of older white people just don't get hip hop. They're all bloating about them and gloating and bragging about themselves and this and that, and it's all misogynistic and blah, blah, blah. They don't get where these people came from. They don't get where the culture came from, where the music came from, and the ethnicity of the people. Like, these were poor Black people when we started out in the 1970s in the Bronx. Like you said, the competition, that's all they had. Competition was their way they expressed it. They weren't like, okay, yeah, we're all in it together. We all love each other. How can you love each other when you're in poverty?
It's like you said, it's an outgrowth of survivalism. Really.
And in an odd way, that competition, that competitive spirit that was well within the music of hip hop, in a way, that was the brotherhood. That was what brought them together, was the competition. It wasn't lovey-dovey peace vibes, but yet lovey-dovey peace vibes still kind of emerged in their own way through the competition. And that's what a lot of, white privilege idiots don't get.
Exactly. Like you said, and I should point out that when we're talking about Black people, it's not exclusive to them. It's there were in the Bronx at that point. There was an influx of immigrants from the Caribbean, especially from Jamaica and Puerto Rico, and so
there were a lot of an underrated number of Latino and Hispanic people living in New York City did contribute to early hip hop.
Yeah, especially the b-boys and the breakdancers, like the Rocksteady crew. I mean, a lot of the early breakdancing crews were predominantly Puerto Rican, actually. And so that's kind of was their sort of corner of the hip hop competitive early universe. And so again, this is all organic. It's just like, just grab what's around. You have your dad's record collection. And it has like all that cool James Brown and Grand Funk Railroad. More on that a little bit later. And stuff like that. And you're just turning. You ain't got much, but in a way, I guess it's a spiritual cousin of country music. If you think about it, they're although I don't know, here's the difference between country and hip hop. That like Appalachian music, they were poor white people, but they were singing songs of lament and loss, whereas hip hop was like, fuck lament and loss. We illin'. We chilling. We out here dominating, and we out here destroying motherfuckers.
It's a refusal to stay negative. You got to make something positive out of this. Right? They weren't wallowing in their sadness, and there's nothing wrong with that. Great music has come people wallowing in sadness, but this was an alternative to wallowing in sadness.
Yeah, and so it's like one element block party and one element sport,
right?
Is really what hip hop is. And then we kind of alluded at it, and it's wonderful that you quoted Nick Cave, because this makes this last point for us very well. White people cannot claim any part of hip hop's invention at all. Now, in the rock narrative, and folks will remember late last year, we did a 2-part series on the first golden age of rock, as we call it, which is the period between 54 and 59 is what we defined it as, correct?
Yeah.
And what we split that into 2 episodes, and basically, between us, kind of half jokingly, we called one the black episode and the other the white episode. Which, and the white episode is mostly about appropriating what the black forerunners of rock and roll had done previous to them. However, there was one element of rock and roll's formation that was definitely very white, and that was Appalachian folk and the Western swing and country music of Texas, especially the West Texas bunch, and Tennessee. And those areas, you had that very rural white music that even Chuck Berry, but in this case, white people have no claim on hip hop's origins at all. And not only that, they can barely claim to have anything to do with its breakout either. Now, granted, you needed white owned labels with some money to help, but think about it. The first hip hop single of any note, the Sugar Hill Gang's "Rapper's Delight," which is the first recorded and widely released single, that was put out by a small, tiny label owned by a black woman. And then from there, you get a few years later, in the MTV era, you get the breakout of Run DMC and LL Cool J. Well, who's mostly responsible for that? Russell Simmons. So along with Rick Rubin. So like Rick Rubin is the closest thing that a white person can say that, yeah, I had something to do with hip hop.
Yeah. But Rick Rubin came well after the parameters of hip hop were established.
Oh, well after. He just was he just was brought in to help produce some of the music and help form Def Jam with Russell. But Russell was he was the man with the hustle and the talent. And so this is a very uniquely black American creation with black predecessors setting the musical tone. And by that, what I mean is that the original source of inspiration was funk and soul breaks, or sort of even the Temptations, in some ways, but you're talking like James Brown and some of those other artists as well. And so it's a black art form, a black creation that is almost wholly motivated by the music from black artists that emitted from vinyl records.
Right, exactly. And Chris, you mentioned about these 4 points. Let's now go into those 4 elements from the third point that you mentioned, and we're going to explore those elements. You mentioned DJing, MCing, breakdancing, graffiti, the 4 elements of hip hop culture, really, more than anything else.
Yeah,
not just
absolutely.
The music, but the culture. We're talking about the culture.
Yeah, and obviously, breakdancing and graffitiing and even DJing, 3 of these 4 have lost their steam over the years as it's become more of an industry, and it's become, basically the main product of the labels these days. But these were and where that language comes from. So, like I said, there was the hip hop culture. It stems from not just the overwhelming poverty, but it comes out of the gang warfare that happened in the very early 70s before a truce. And so now you still have some of that same violence, and it's not that goes away. And so there was this effort to take that tribal warfare mindset and flip it and make it a positive thing. And so you could still be tribal and still be primal, but do it in a positive way. And so, so this idea, and it really comes from the mighty Zulu nation, the universal Zulu nation, which is Afrika Bambaataa's creation. So in other words, what are the fire, earth, water, and air of hip hop? And so that's sort of where the elements thing comes from. And so, as Arturo mentioned, we'll go through them individually, and I'll allow you to make some comments here, Arturo. DJing.
Right.
Now, have you ever wondered out there, folks, and Arturo, like some of the seminal acts of late 80s, sort of that golden age of that old school hip hop? You ever wonder why some of these groups are Eric B and Rakim and not Rakim and Eric B, or why it's DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince and not the Fresh Prince and DJ Jazzy Jeff? Yeah, because the DJ was the king. The DJ was he was the man with the music. He was the one that was hype, that was keeping the crowd on its toes. He was the master of the turntables. He was the freshest guy in the yard. Without the DJ, you didn't have the party. So that's where the power was. And really within DJing, there's a couple of things. One, there is the technique, and the big innovation there was what is known as the breaks. And, this is something that a lot of younger folks probably don't picture. This is what makes us realize, Art, that we're in our 40s now. That by the breaks, what it is you have a DJ and he's got two turntables. And what it is you've got the same, that sort of, think of like James Brown's Give It Up and Turn It Loose, or the Incredible Bongo Band's Apache, which are two of the more popular breaks or sample sections that were used back then, and even still now, especially Apache. But what you do is you have one turntable where you have it queued up 5 seconds before you have it on the other one. And so you play it on one turntable and you have that 5 second, like with that break there. And then you switch to the other one and you queue it up and you repeat it. And while the second turntable is playing, you're backing up the first one to the start of the break. And so the second one starts, now you're back to the first, you queue up the second one again. And so it just over and over and over. So in other words, the groove, the break, the groove never stops. And so
it also explains why a lot of these the early hip hop songs up to 79, 80, a lot of those singles were really long singles. They were like 7, 8, some of them even 9 minutes long, because the whole point of it was to keep people dancing. Keep people on the dance floor. Keep the party going for as long as possible. Right,
and the texture was in the break, and it was the break that kept people hyped. It was kind of the hypnosis. It was like this was an innovation that, like, a lot of these early hip hop parties, they weren't all about the breaks. I mean, this was something that one of our, we'll be talking about him a little bit later, Kool Herc is credited with coming up with, but it's something that came out, again, it was that creative spirit. How can we like jazz up the party? How can I have my own signature? How can I stand out? And, from that, you get that. And then eventually you get a guy like Grandmaster Flash, who takes the concept of the breaks and is such a nerd that he is able to manipulate mixers and turntables to do that and to get it precise as hell. And not only that, but also put some flair in there too, like Grand Wizard Theodore and him coming up with scratching and doing those types of things. And so, the DJ was the king.
And what happened, I think in starting in I would say the 1990s, the importance of the DJ got replaced by the importance of the producer.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The producer these days is akin to the DJs back then. And so back then it was DJ Jazzy J, or, it was DJ Jones, or it was Kool Herc, or in the 80s, Red Alert. You would have that. Now it's, like, at least from at least 20 years ago, the Neptunes and Timbaland and Kanye West. And then these days, you know, you got the dude that produces Migos, and you've got a few others, young cats like JPEG Mafia. And so, you know, you get these producers. They're kind of the new DJs, but there's a difference though. Back then, the MC was in service of the DJ. Now the producer is in service of the MC.
Yeah.
And
which leads us to MCing, the second element.
Yeah, that leads us to MCing. And so the DJ rocked the party, but the MC eventually led it. And, you know, some of this comes out of, you know, you needed somebody to kind of lead and to be somebody that would be the hype man. Because in a lot of cases, the DJ is like, he's like kind of a big nerd that's like, you know, like spinning records. There's only so much entertainment value you can get from that. So sometimes you need help. And so, yes, an MC emceed the party. And so a lot of the original MCing, it was more akin to dance hall toasting from reggae and from Jamaica, where, you know, you'd have the kind of the chants and the just kind of the, you know, call and response and getting people hyped up, and just, you know, just more of that. But gradually over time, what happened is that, you know, as the DJs and as these parties got bigger, there was more of a need for a show. And so the MCs, and that's where the rapping came in. That's where the rapping came in. And that, again, that comes from the competitive spirit that you know, you have to see that some of these guys back then are saying, well, there's got to be more we can do with this. And so from that comes the boasting. From that comes the some of the early poetics. From some of that comes the battle rapping about why my crew is fresher than yours. Yeah, or you know, or like why my turf is better than your turf, or you know, or even, you know, telling stories, which, you know, happened a little bit at that point too. You know, the Sugar Hill Gang song "Rapper's Delight," you know, has got some of that in it, but, you know, the silly thing about getting the shits, that's, you know, in the original version, or the long version. So, and so it emerges from that. And so the MCs originally were there to just kind of like lead the party. The DJ was still the king, and it grew into a need for the show. And from that, it kind of like, you know, Frankenstein got a heart and a brain, so to speak, you know? Right. Exactly. And you just keep growing. Right. And growing. Speaking of growing physically, the physical aspect of hip hop, the third element, breakdancing. Yeah, otherwise known, or b-boying in the parlance back then. I mean, what the hell's a party without dancing? And so, you know, out of those funk breaks comes that kind of clipped, rapid movements of breakdancing. You know, especially, you know, popping and locking. And a lot of, you know, when we think of breakdancing now, a lot of us think of the guys doing backspins and spinning on their heads and doing a lot of the stuff where they're kind of on the ground. Well, no, but early hip hop dancing was pretty much vertical, but it was like a lot of like swinging, like aggressive movements of the feet or the hands, and just sort of, you know, like just body movements, kind of like weird contortion and those types of things. And again, it really comes out of, there were in gang times, there were dances that would come from that, or from Africa too. Yeah, it was a sort of, you know, kind of tribal one-upsmanship, and sometimes it was the ceremonial one-upsmanship before they started killing each other, or they started hitting each other with spears. And so it kind of comes from that tradition. But it also was a little bit more artistic than that, because, you know, you would get like real dancing and a lot of that. And so miming was an influence on this. And this is a good chance to tell a story. When I was out in Phoenix working for the Phoenix New Times, I edited a story out there that apparently, you know, there was breakdancing there were local breakdancing, and there was a local little breakdancing scene. Well, you know, word on the ground from my reporter was that the old mime duo, and this is old school, like, hell, people our age probably don't remember these guys too much, but Shields and Yarnell, Ever heard of Shields and Yarnell, Arturo?
No, I have not.
Well, there you go. That's how obscure this is. So this was a husband and wife. I believe they were husband and wife uh, mime duo that used to show up on the Sonny and Cher Hour all the time, doing their bits. And like miming, there's a lot of those sort of like exaggerated movements of arms and kind of leaning over and kind of swinging the arm type of thing. Well, it turns out my reporter, the guy who was working for me, Jimmy McGahern, Jimmy, if you're listening, hello, found out from one of the break dancers that Shields and Yarnell was an influence in what they were doing. And he did the research, and it turns out, yes, Shields and Yarnell were actually an influence on some of what the popping and locking, came from. And then it was really cool because it turns out that Shields, who was I think it was Shields, who was the male, and if I get that wrong, I apologize, but I think it was Shields. It was the male half of that duo, lived up in Sedona, which is 2 hours north of Phoenix. And so through some some clever approaches, we were able to get the old mime Shields together with the kids to break dance together. And so nice. That just kind of shows you the transcendence of it. But anyway,
I think it's also important to notice that this element of hip hop, the breakdancing, it was the first element, I think, that actually made a serious impression on mainstream white America. Yeah. Because look at all the Hollywood movies that came out of that. Breaking. Breaking 2, Electric Boogaloo. What was the other one? Beat Street. That was the other one.
Crush Groove. Well, Crush Groove is more of a rapping one though. So yeah, no, you're right, and that actually sets up a next point. So yes, in terms of it was the breakdancing that was sort of a positive representation of hip hop culture, and so it wasn't. Well, that beatboxing was people were obsessed with beatboxing too, which is another. That was kind of the MC as DJ. That was the whole point of beatboxing. Was just a really clever, again, another one is like creative. When there's no rules, when nobody's watching and there's no rules, everything's on the table. So there was a positive representation to it. And again, it bears repeating. This was sort of the diversity of, and so not just of folks that, they weren't necessarily, old, affiliated with the gangs or anything like that, but you're talking like Puerto Rican and more Caribbean dancers. And so there was a more diverse element to it there. So breakdancing was the positive thing that first got into white mainstream culture. What do you think the negative thing was that probably had more of a pronounced effect on white America?
I don't think it's negative at all. I think there's some beautiful, great graffiti art out there. But at the time, graffiti had a very negative connotation attached.
Absolutely.
Graffiti,
absolutely.
The fourth element of hip hop culture.
Graffiti to me is the most fascinating of the four elements because it was literally the one that had no boundaries, and it had no rules, and it had no basically you could represent for your turf, because you remember a lot of these were neighborhood crews that were doing this, but graffiti artists were kind of like, they were truly anarchists, and it was like it was almost like taking back property from Whitey. And so we tag subway cars, we tag bridges, we tag tunnels, we tag blank walls in projects, we tag guardrails, or like highway bridges, and all this kind of stuff. And so there was just a real, and it brought like like you said, an artistic flavor to it. And it was actually the graffiti, because you remember Fab Five Freddy, who Fred Braithwaite. He hosted Yo MTV Raps, but he was a graffiti artist, and it was the graffiti artists that first got embraced by the white intelligentsia down in the Village. Yeah,
name checked by Deborah Harry of Blondie in the song Rapture.
Yeah, absolutely. And also the Upper East, the upper crust, Upper East folks, and that scene, they embraced the graffiti artists first. They were the first that actually got the sort of, hey, this is credible. And from there, it was the graffiti artists that, in some ways, and obviously Fred Braithwaite, Fat Five Freddy is indicative of this. It was the graffiti artists that vouched for the artistry of everything else,
Right.
in a lot of ways. And so that's kind of where it starts, but that doesn't really come until like well, certainly after 79 and with the Sugar Hill Gang, but it doesn't really start to come until about 81, 82 that you start to get that transition, and where
Oh yeah.
so and it migrates
Back. Check this out. Back in 1981,
Mhm.
the Clash, the punk rock band, they were on what was it? What's the guy Snyder? John,
uh
just the talk show host, the American talk show host,
oh, Tom Snyder.
Tom Snyder. They were on Tom Snyder's show, and this was back in 1981. And the Clash was like the peak of their popularity, and they were performing their standalone single, "This Is Radio Clash." And while they were performing, they had some graffiti artists because because this was filmed in New York. While they were performing, they had some graffiti artists in the back behind the
Oh,
drummer
that's cool.
doing their graffiti stuff while the Clash were playing. So that was another way how the Clash cleverly aligned themselves with a hip new style of hip hop.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And we said before that there was a negative connotation that it was looked on negatively because let's face it, graffiti by its very nature, it was an act. It was the only act of actual true against the law rebellion in all of
Right.
hip hop. And
Yeah.
so, one person's beautiful art is another person's vandalism. And
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
suppose, and think about it, it really is kind of a claim for ownership of like, oh, okay, I'm going to own that by tagging it with my graffiti,
Yeah.
or I'm going to own that now. And it's like, oh, you're not going to own that. We're going to bury you. And so you're a thug, you're a criminal, you're a hood, you're all that. And so this was just, and not only that, but it was an eyesore too. That I mean, you're talking about property owners.
Yeah.
Essentially what happened was graffiti caught on so well that it wasn't just contained to the South Bronx or the West
Yeah.
Bronx. I mean, you end up with like fucking Grand Central Station, with with graffiti. And so it's like when they start bombing and they start tagging places that actually have real property value. Now all of a sudden that's when they're criminals. So, but yeah, and you did have it. And so you would have these parties. Now take those four elements, and now you have like a big like courtyard party at these places. And think about it. You've got not just one DJ, but you would have like huge block parties where you have like DJs competing with each other. And generally speaking, the Kool Herc thing, the guy with the best sound system would win because he would just
Right.
overwhelm everybody else. You couldn't hear everybody else. So you had that. You had the MCs going and getting all the crowd hyped. You got the breakdancing, and you've got the artists, making the graffiti. And so you've got all of this stuff going on. And a lot of this stuff, like literally you've never seen before, you've never heard before, nobody's ever attempted before, and they're inventing stuff on the fly. And the thing about it was all improv. I mean, there was no standard of this is what people are expecting when you come to this show. This is what you must provide them. It wasn't like a rock show or like Nirvana back in 1992. Hey, place smells like Teen Spirit.
Yeah.
It wasn't all that. So there were really like legitimately no expectations. And so I can just imagine being a resident of the South Bronx in like 1975 and going to one of these parties. Like, Afrika Bambaataa was kind of the king of the Bronx River projects, and like,
Right.
going to a party in the Bronx River projects, and like literally like not knowing what you're going to see that night, or like what Bambaataa is going to pull out of his bag of tricks as far as what he was, what records he was going to play, or like you didn't know what moves you were going to see from the B-boys, or and just it all was being formed on the fly. And so from that you get a lot of myths. We said in the beginning of the episode that that this party that Kool Herc threw for the first time with his sound system, on August 11th, 1973, that people want to make this as the date that hip hop was invented. And so, so hip hop turns 50. And I'm like, bullshit. It was a very dynamic, gradual, just sort of it just kind of formed. And when nobody's chronicling it, then, and there's no rules, now just everything it all just comes together organically and beautifully. And there's not a whole lot of art forms you can say that about.
On this episode, we talked about the birth of hip hop. That, of course, took place in our beloved New York City. For the next episode, yours truly, Curmudgeons, will remain in the Big Apple, but the focus will go back to our beloved rock music. Many songs over the many years have been written about New York City, but we're not paying attention to Frank Sinatra, Billie Holiday, or any jazz or big band artists. And we're avoiding hip-hop for this one, not only because we just did an episode on hip-hop, but because we can do an entire 5-episode series on hip-hop songs just about New York. No, we're focusing on rock, R&B, soul, and funk, and artists such as... Nope, we're not giving you any hints on this promo. Suffice it to say, yours truly, Curmudgeons, will give you the definitive list of the greatest songs of the rock era ever written about New York City. Join us next time for the 20 most quintessentially New York City rock songs ever. All right, well, so far when talking about the birth of hip hop, we've been talking about it on a macro level. Like I said, the 4 elements, DJing, MCing, breakdancing, graffiti, the 4 points of hip hop and culturally and what it meant, why it became what it became. Now let's go to a micro level, because there were individual human beings who were part of this whole thing. And there were people. These were flesh and blood breathing human beings who did this and created this. And when it comes to hip hop and the music, there are 4 individuals in particular who really need to be talked about. The first person, Chris, and you mentioned him already, Kool Herc.
Yes, Kool Herc. If anybody can be said to say, okay, well, who was the creator of the music of hip hop? If anybody could lay claim to that, it would be Kool Herc. So here is Herc's story. Herc is born Clive Campbell. He was a Jamaican immigrant. He actually, according to Can't Stop, Won't Stop, he actually lived in the same building in Trenchtown that Marley grew up in for a stretch. So go figure. His family moves when Clive is young. The name Kool Herc comes from the fact that he was a big, huge jack motherfucker who excelled athletically. And, hence he was Hercules.
Yeah.
And he caught on to an interest in DJing and playing music early. And he came from a very musical household. I mean, in terms of what they had, the big Temptations fans, or lots of James Brown and lots of Aretha Franklin, a lot of early black music or R&B. And so it was a very musical household. And what happens is that he's trying to, his dad had a sound system that Herc really truly wanted to use at some point, but his dad wouldn't let him because he didn't trust him with it, because it was a super jacked up system. Well, what happened is that Herc, without permissions, I guess he starts futzing around with some of the wires in this sound system, and he gets it to the point where he gets it super duper souped up. And it's like, Dad, hey, I figured this out. So, now that I've got this to a point where I can actually host a big party with it, will you let me do it? And he's like, well, okay. And so therefore, with the help of his sister, He promotes this party at his apartment building, and he was actually in the West Bronx. It's a little west of where the real bad stuff was happening, but still wasn't great. On Sedgwick Avenue in the Bronx, in the rec room of this apartment building, here comes Herc blasting his sound system. And at that point, he wasn't doing the breaks. It was just basically a party, but it was folks getting together, and he stood out because, again, the man with it was the same thing in Jamaica. The man with the power is the man that people gravitate towards, and Kool Herc had the power,
and he had presence. He was literally a big guy.
Yeah, and he was this big, awesome, like literally like he had like Hulk Hogan biceps. I mean, he was a big dude. And so he starts to, with his sound system, he starts to get more parties. He starts to get out there. He's, sharing more of his music that he loves. And then at some point, he comes up with this concept. We talked about it earlier with the breaks. He called it the merry-go-round, which again was the two turntables with the same part of a track isolated at different intervals, so you could essentially repeat it nonstop. And so from there, the legend of Herc's parties grew, and really, people gravitated towards him because of his presence and charisma, because of the music, because of the breaks, because of the noise, and it was the place to be were Herc's parties. And so and so he never broke out of the Bronx. Essentially, when he was about, I think he was like 18 or something like that when he first started, maybe even a little younger. And he's playing these parties, and you're playing for like kids. It's like basically all ages. It's families and all of that. And so at some point, maybe you get a desire to start playing for adults. The kids that you were playing for, your peers, well, they're now adults. Well, now they're not going to be hanging out at all ages parties. They want to be hanging out at clubs. Well, Herc tried to go up in rank, and at one point he ended up getting mugged and stabbed and injured pretty badly. And so he never really made it that far as his ambitions out there. And then, of course, 79 happens, and a lot of those folks in that early scene got left behind, and Herc was one of them. However,
why did they get left behind? They just they weren't good enough. They weren't good enough beyond their initial success, or
no. I think what it was just Herc. It was just the how much bigger and better could it get? I mean, again, according to the book and according to narratives I've read, that things were starting to peter out in like 1978 in general in the Bronx, and a lot of the parties and a lot of the music was starting to slowly edge out of the Bronx and more towards
to Brooklyn.
Yeah, to like Brooklyn and to Queens and even into New Jersey.
Wow.
And so it was petering out a little bit, and then Herc, because of the injury that he had, and because it was just, there was a little bit of a groove of time in between when it started to phase out and when the Sugar Hill Gang comes. He never proceeded. Whereas, Bambaataa and others, they were able to get record deals and they became more famous. Herc sort of got left behind, but it was kind of a combination of circumstance and his own volition. Now, granted, over the years, he's been picked up, and he is seen as, he's basically like one of the godfathers of hip hop, and he's gotten his flowers. Let's just put it that way. And he's gotten high profile gigs. He still performs now on sort of like nostalgia circuit type of gigs, and just a really engaging. When you see interviews, he's a really engaging guy. He's now 68 years old. And just was just a really bright performer, and the fact that he could come up with the breaks and sustain them for that long, just coming up with that alone, he's the man who invented the sample. Essentially that's what he did. He essentially created the live sample. And so Kool Herc forever and a day. Big ups.
All right. The second guy on this, they're men.
Yeah,
The second
they are
person,
men.
they are men. The second person of the four, like really important forefathers of hip hop, and he's still alive as well. Afrika Bambaataa.
Yes. Now, I'm sure that most people listening to us have heard of Afrika Bambaataa, and you will associate him with the series of great singles that he was associated with and helped produce in the early 80s. Planet Rock, Renegades of Funk, Looking for the Perfect.
Planet Rock, sampling Kraftwerk, Trans-Europe Express.
Yes, absolutely. And then Looking for the Perfect Beat, which is my favorite of those singles, where he was working with Arthur Baker. It was a British producer, most famously associated with New Order. So that's what y'all know him from. But his true importance comes before any of that happens. And so here's Mr. Bambaataa's story. Real name Lance Taylor. Nobody knew that for years. He was kind of a man of mystery. A lot of people thought it might be Kevin Donovan, but I think that they got that wrong because they looked at his sheet and it was like maybe like the sound guy or something instead of him. It's like, and they got that wrong. But he kind of intentionally was vague about his history and played up to mythology. And so a lot of the language and a lot of the mythology and a lot of the tribalism and a lot of the sort of the quirky nature of like the very old school hip hop comes from Bambaataa. Again, the elements really starts with Bambaataa and the Mighty Zulu Nation. He grew up in the southeast Bronx, the southeast corner of the Bronx, along the Bronx River. He was a housing project called the Bronx River Projects. And one thing that makes him stand out among this crowd is he was an actual gangster. Before he embarked in his escapades as a musician and as a DJ, he was an actual warlord for a gang called the Black Spades. And as a warlord, he was the guy who was tasked with expanding the Black Spades turf. Wow. And so, which means you have to be the political guy to come in and form alliances, and so you can expand that turf, and so you can kind of spread your dominance. And so it's kind of a diplomatic position, but he was doing it for the purposes of expanding the rackets and expanding the violence and the drugs and the crime at that point. And he said he was a big deal in the Spades. Well, what happens is at a certain point, and he's in high school when this is happening. He was really young. Well, at some point in high school, I think he's a senior in high school. There was an essay contest that his school was doing because he bust into a whiter school in the Bronx, and they had an essay contest, and the winner of the essay contest would get a paid trip to Africa. And so he won the essay contest, and he was able to go experience Africa firsthand, and it blew him away. And he came back from that saying that we're going to now get away from this negative energy, and we're going to turn it into this sort of building positive and building things on Black empowerment.
In other words, get out of crime.
Yeah, basically. And so take that same tribalism and turn it into something positive. And so the idea is, we're not slinging drugs, we're not robbing, we're not getting into knife fights or those. No, now we're DJing, now we're MCing, now we're spreading positivity in the community. We're offering knowledge. We're policing our own, and from that comes the universal Zulu Nation. And there was a lot of eclecticism to that in terms of the sort of the shamanistic dress that Bambaataa is known for, the emblems that they wore, which some of those came from voodoo, and and sort of like more New Orleans type of things. And their slogan was peace, love, unity, and having fun. And they were an extremely prolific mix of DJs, b-boys, graffiti artists, and MCs. At some point, starting in about 75, you couldn't go to a party in the Bronx that wasn't in some ways overwhelmed by Zulu Nation reps.
Here's the one thing you mentioned: peace, love, unity, having fun. Later in the 1980s, James Brown would record a single with Afrika Bambaataa called Peace, Love, Unity, and Having Fun.
Yeah, well, that was the chorus. It was called Unity.
Oh, units, right? Sorry,
Yeah,
sorry.
and it was funny that he got that. So that was his contribution. Now, it was really, he took it to the extremes in terms of how he built the Zulu nation, and it really was. It was based on just sort of this African wisdom and just sort of being the benevolent leader of the tribe. And let me read this. So they had a thing that one of the things that a lot of literature came from the Zulu nation, and they had this thing that they called infinity lessons. And infinity lessons were these precepts, these decrees, these ways of living, and and it really kind of got into their worldview of how we can combine Afrocentrism with our community here in the Bronx. Now, here's quoting from the original Infinity Lessons document, which actually this is available the ZuluNation.com. The Zulu Nation is still in existence today. And so this is pretty wild, but in some ways it's incredible. Quote, as the circle expands, our collective consciousness grows, bringing us to ever higher realizations of divinity. As we are individually aligned with our true nature, the whole of humanity is strengthened. By focusing on our own development, you will serve all of humanity. At different times in history, certain fully realized beings have come to teach us by revealing different parts of the plan for the development of humanity as a whole. These teachings have all focused on the universal truths and have taught about the power of love. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Multiplied and exponential growth. As more and more of us discover the truth inside, the new world is inside you. Zulu kings bring forth the vision that we may all exist in harmony. We celebrate our divine nature and appreciate it, our individual contributions to the good of the group. This is the true nature of the age of Aquarius. Through coming together with music and dance, we unite.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds better already than most of like the self-help, positive thinking guru con artists that are out there.
Yeah, I was going to say, although, said he got a career on this. And so eventually, as he got away from his time in the mainstream, which we talked about with those singles, the Zulu Nation became like a movement, was popular on college campuses and those types of things. He came to add a fifth element, which was knowledge. So it was not just the DJing and the MCing, the b-boying and the graffiti. Now it was knowledge. And so they made something meaningful out of it. That the idea, and Bambaataa is important because if anybody can claim to be the inventor of the music, it's Kool Herc. If anybody can claim to be the inventor of the culture and the importance that we put on it, and the positivity, the positive focused competition,
right?
That like you talked about before, it's Bambaataa.
Right.
Now, as a very sad postscript, by the way.
Yeah, I was about to say, starting 7 years ago, we started hearing or reading about allegations by not just one or two, but several men who mentioned, like, when they were young boys, how Bambaataa sexually molested them. And apparently it wasn't just one or two kids. Like, it was pretty widespread.
Yeah, and eventually this comes out, and so long story short, Bambaataa is no longer in the Zulu Nation. They've disassociated themselves with him. I understand that somebody I read that there was a lawsuit filed against him in 2021 from somebody claiming sexual abuse. Wow. So it's like we said in our James Brown episodes, love the art, not so much the artist. Once in a while. Yeah, you never know. These people have a dark side, but man,
a lot of artists. I mean, honestly, if we start canceling artists for having their dark side, we'll have no music left.
Yeah, we'll have no artists. I mean, it's kind of a scary thought, but that's a discussion for another day too. But needless to say, Bambaataa's influence on hip hop culture and the development of early hip hop. Oh, and should mention he was a kick-ass DJ too. He was the one that kind of revolutionized the idea of programming by the DJ. So it wasn't just like the same 5 or 6 breaks. Like he would whip out Grand Funk Railroad, or like We're an American Band, or he would play like Brit pop, or like, kind of like British invasion music, or he would play disco, or he would, and so he kind of was known for his crates more than most of the DJs, and so a lot of fun, a lot of unpredictability, and a lot of just sort of expression through his vinyl, and so that was sort of his trademark, and so
that brings us to the third important forefather and individual. Speaking of DJs, this guy, Grandmaster Flash. This dude was a virtuoso.
Yes, absolutely. So if those two guys were innovators as DJs, or excuse me, if those guys were inventors as DJs, then the innovator of all innovators was Grandmaster Flash. Born Joseph Sadler, he was a Barbadian immigrant who grew up in the Bronx, and he was one of these. He was from early on. He was a big techie nerd. He was like a mad scientist type. That he was the kind of kid that would want to take the CB radios and take them apart just so he can put them back together again and figure out how to soup things up and make things better, or make tweaks. And he was the experimenter. He was the he was the geek. And so, if most of the people at the parties were like smoking spliffs and, and drinking 40s and just, getting their party on, he was sitting there studying what Herc was doing. He was studying like, okay, his breaks. So what's he doing? So how can I do better breaks? And so, he would do things like, he manipulated the needles, he manipulated the mixers, he, in terms of what the sound system would do. And, he was one of these guys that, if he were a vinyl collector, he was a guy who would be kind of annoying, that he would go on there, you give him records to use and he would like ruin them because he was scratching them up so much from all of his experimentation. So he was kind of, what he did, he got it to the point where he could get those breaks precise as hell and really artistic and really just sort of sounding like, instead of like, you don't want to call it haphazard, but breaks, the merry-go-round certainly was improv, and it was clever, but it wasn't precise.
Right.
It wasn't precise, and it wasn't kind of like something that came out of test tubes. But whereas what Grandmaster Flash did was, and there's a wonderful passage in Can't Stop, Won't Stop, and I know that I keep mentioning that book, but it's worth talking about, where Flash figures out this precision and he goes and debuts it, and nobody in the crowd is moved at all. Why? Because it's just some DJ doing boring shit, and he didn't have the charisma. And so from this, and this is one of his great contributions, is not only was he the kind of the mad scientist and the guy that like really honed the craft of the break and of the sample, of the what I'll call the live sample, he also assembled several rappers,
right?
And most famously Melly Mel, and he wasn't an MC, but he helped really put the spotlight on the MC. Yes, and what he did, exactly. So what they did is he formed, it eventually became the Furious Five, and so it would be several rappers up there, and they were the show. Right. And so rather than him, being the showman, and everybody, was fascinated by what he did, but that alone wasn't going to get him over in professional wrestling terms. It was, so this is now bringing the MCs. Now you start to get creeping lyricism. And so from that, you start to get MC crews. And, the Cold Crush Brothers that formed in 1978 being one of the more famous ones, examples of those. And so you got these MC crews coming up, and a lot of that was an outgrowth of, this introverted, geeky DJ out there trying to figure out how to keep the party hype. So he did that. And then eventually, they, Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, they became famous again. They were another one of those artists like Bambaataa that found their way onto a label, and in the early 80s had a couple of brilliant singles, The Message and White Lines being the most famous of them. And so, long live Grandmaster Flash. He was the scientist. He was in some ways he was hip hop's first producer.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Because like we said, I think the shift from DJ to producer. I mean, a lot of people would credit Dr. Dre for being one of the people in the late 80s, early 90s. Like, he was a DJ, but with NWA, he was the producer, really.
Yeah. Well, I think it was Marley Marl more than him that kind of made the producer the big artiste.
Right.
But Flash was, because he was an engineer. He was a born engineer.
Right.
He kind of came up, without, he didn't have, studio consoles or whatever tools he had at his disposal. He was able to come up with the same effect. And so I think that there's a direct lineage from Flash to Dre to now, some of the younger guys, Kanye, obviously. And so there's a big lineage there. So more power to Grandmaster Flash.
And then the fourth person, the fourth and final person, as you said, these hip hop forefathers, I would have thought Melly Mel was the original dope ass lyricist, but you say no. You say it's Grandmaster Caz.
Yeah, Caz and Melly Mel is probably more famous. Like there's a reason that I'm signaling out Grandmaster Caz, because he kind of was a right place, right time kind of guy.
Right.
And yes, he was an MC, and he was one of the first to actually have lyrics that made sense and told stories and had something more to say. And he was more, and he was fluid too. And so, and obviously, a lot of the sort of the early history of MCs is kind of unrecorded. There were MCs that bubbled up, and the MCs really start to bubble up on the late edge of this, 77, 78, 79, when they kind of graduate from being the kind of the toasters to now being performers. And so you started to get, again, the Cold Crush Brothers, which he joined. He wasn't an original Cold Crush brother, but he joined them.
Right.
But he was just became legendary, and we'll get into that for a reason. The reason I'm singling him out, Melly Mel, is an interesting character. He's another one of those guys like Kool Herc that was like pure charisma, but he was more old school and he was more limited. Caz, was really a focused lyricist. And the main reason I'm mentioning him is what we're going to talk about next, was that lyrics that were stolen by his manager showed up in the first hip hop single, Known to Man. And so there's a connection between what Caz was writing and what got on the radio. And so he kind of helps form that bridge there, coincidentally, accidentally, whatever you want to say. But there's a bridge that goes from the Grandmaster Cazes of the world and the Melly Mels of the world to what ended up on the radio, and then how it formed from there, because it was pretty soon after that Kurtis Blow was the first rapper signed to a major label.
Yeah.
And that was in 1980. He came out.
Right. So I guess this is that's a classic song. I still like that song.
Yeah.
Anyway,
great
song. This is a great segue into that hip hop single that you are talking about, the immortal Rapper's Delight by the Sugar Hill Gang.
Yes, Rapper's Delight, which is one of the more curious and fascinating stories in the history of radio, certainly. And without Rapper's Delight, you don't get what we know today as hip hop. And so what had happened, as I said before, that really the hip hop movement of the Bronx belonged to those teenagers and very young adults that were coming of age in the South and the southern half of the Bronx in the mid 70s, the early to mid 70s. Well, at that point, you were starting to get a little bit of aging out, that, okay, we no longer want to party in the courtyards with the kids. We want to go, we want to be in the clubs, or whatever. And so you started to get a gradual fading out that was happening there. And so, but at the same time, the way things go, the originators, they're 5 years and 6 years ahead of the curves. They're starting to calm down. Meanwhile, the people outside of the Bronx are starting to catch on to this, and it's starting to get more popular in the tri-state area, which means you've got, hey, dollar and a dream, baby. You have lots of entrepreneurs out there. And there's some of these folks that are hearing this and are being like, holy shit. I mean, we've never heard anything like that. What if we could do something with that? Can we make records out of that? And ironically enough, Grandmaster Flash was one of the people that thought that they couldn't, because everything was so improv and everything was so long, and it was, everything was designed for the party, which means it had to go on for hours. It wasn't something that lent itself to even a 15-minute nugget, which the long version of Rapper's Delight is about 14 minutes and 30 seconds. So, and in some ways that's like short for what was going on at this point. Yeah. And so while the first wave and all these pioneers and all these innovators and all of this energy is starting to fade a little bit there in the Bronx, it's starting to pick up a little bit in the corporate circles or in the entrepreneurial circles. And so right place, right time. Here's the story. So there's a woman named Sylvia Robinson who, along with her brother, ran a very tiny label called Sugar Hill Records, which is named after the Sugar Hill neighborhood in Harlem.
Right.
And so she is out and about and gets her eyes on hip hop, sees a hip hop performance, and the money signs go in her eyes and say, that's how I'm gonna break out my label. That's how I'm gonna succeed. So now she's out there scouting, and she's trying to figure out how she can do this. Well, she's out in, I believe it's Edgewater, New Jersey, at a pizza joint. And so there's a guy working in this pizza parlor in Edgewater, New Jersey, named Big Bank Hank. And he is listening to a Cold Crush Brothers song. I believe it was Cold Crush Brothers. And he's rapping while he's working to this Cold Crush Brothers song. Yeah. And just a cappella or whatever as he's going. Well, Sylvia Robinson is a customer, happens to hear him rapping. He's like, oh, okay. Hey, would you like to make a record? And it's a recruit's Big Bang Hank, who's rhyming lyrics written by Grandmaster Caz, who Hank is managing at that time. He is Grandmaster Caz. Remember, there's no money in hip hop at this time. Yeah. So Grandmaster Caz's manager is working at a pizza joint in New Jersey.
Lots of inbred networking here.
yeah, exactly. And so it's like, holy shit. And so what they did is, so now they have Hank in tow. So the label holds auditions, and they find two other guys, Wonder Mike and Master G, and they get them together, and they just basically they book a session, and out of that session comes Rapper's Delight. And so naturally, the fabulous early explosion of hip hop that was effectively introduced to the world outside of the tri-state area, it was done so in the most prefab way possible. Yeah. And so now, so they do this and they come up with this. So these guys, none of these three guys have any credibility or any identity. They have no connection to the Bronx parties or the Bronx scene. They have no connection to any of the pioneers. They're just like three random dudes that are just hired to make a rap single for this lady that wants to see if she can get first mover advantage. Well, lo and behold, holy shit, she did. And so it gets out into radio, and in the summer of '79, it blows up, as in like 40,000 plays a week, kind of blowed up.
And what music did it sample, or interpolate?
Good Times by Chic.
Yeah.
And so what it is they're in a studio and they have a backing band doing a very crude interpolation of Good Times by Chic, that bass line and that little guitar lick to try to recreate that. And they're rapping over it, and they're going on for 15 minutes. And it's a fascinating song. It's a fun song. It really is good. It's a classic single, like it hypes up a party, and it did a brilliant accidental job of capturing the spirit of those hip hop parties. I mean, there were people that were shocked at the time that they could even get it down to 15 minutes. Yeah. And this is hilarious to me that Big Bank Hank, when he goes to use lyrics for that, he wrote some of the lyrics, but he also stole some that he had in his possession from Caz. And so when he first comes in like the second minute of the song, the first lyric you hear from him, and Grand Caz was short for Casanova Fly, by the way.
No.
And so his first lyric is, check it out. I'm the CASAN, the OVA, and the rest is FLY. And so he's telling everybody that he's a different dude.
Yeah.
The first time we hear him.
Yeah.
I mean, and so, yeah, hip hop's all about appropriation, but that was just downright theft. And of course, Caz has been bitching ever since. I mean, I'm sure he probably got a few bucks out of that, but not nearly.
Few.
Yeah.
Just a few bucks.
Yeah.
Here's the thing about Chic's Good Times. It's the gift that kept on giving. Because not only did we get the Sugar Hill Gang's Rapper's Delight, the next year, in the year 1980, Chic's Good Times, it would not be copied, but it really, really was the basis for one of the biggest hit songs in pop music history. Queen's Another One Bites the Dust.
Yeah, that's a good point. Obviously, if you're going to appropriate anything for the first hip hop single, you might as well be Good Times by Chic. And so all of this is a very happy accident. If this one lady hadn't walked into this one pizza joint in New Jersey in 1979 and overhearing some random dude rapping some other guy's lyrics under his breath, we wouldn't have hip hop, the industrial product, the actual commodity of hip hop. We would not have it if it wasn't for that. And so it's worth talking about that story, because what it shows is that of course the most magical organic thing ever arguably to happen in music kind of stumbles its way into prominence. That it wasn't really at the behest of anybody that had anything to do with the scene. There was nobody in there that was that ambitious. Now, granted, once the ball got rolling downhill in 1980, Curtis Blow was signed to a major, but Bambaataa and Grandmaster Flash and the Cold Crush Brothers and the Treacherous Three, all those bands, all those groups, they all had deals by 1981, and it went from there. But none of those guys was actually ambitious as like a, hey, it was a, hey, look at me culture. It wasn't a, hey, look at me, now let's go make like $1 million.
Yeah. It was, hey, look at me, I am somebody, more than anything.
Look at me, I am somebody, and we're surviving the South Bronx in the 1970s by holding the best parties in the history of the universe.
Yeah.
I said this was not a commercial racket. This was not an entrepreneurship play. I mean, it was pure fun. It was pure music. It was pure culture. And lo and behold, it was outsiders that brought it to the world.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Absolutely. And hip hop, it's a music made by outsiders that eventually brought the insiders in, and hip hop became the ultimate insider mainstream pop music that it is now.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so, so what is the legacy of this? Arturo, if I had to ask you what the legacy of what these folks were doing there in the pre-dawn of hip hop there in the Bronx, what would you say the major legacy? How would you articulate that?
DIY, do it yourself. You don't have to go to music school and spend thousands of dollars to play an instrument extremely well and play music with like 10 chord progressions and 50 notes per second and study the greats of music. Just go out there and do your thing yourself, your own way. You don't have to go to school to do it, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And not only that, but the hip hop itself is about competition, but it's also about innovation. And so it's up to the next guy to figure, or the next person to figure out how to advance it. And so it's no longer in the Bronx. It's now it's around the corner from you. It's your next door neighbor. It's your uncle.
Right. Exactly.
It's all over the place. And so, yeah, absolutely.
DIY and community via competition, which is a hard thing for some people to understand, but yeah, that's what it was.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, there's also, when you talk about the legacy too, and it's extraordinary because people and some of these persons, they keep figuring out ways to advance it, and so from there, you get like trap music, or you get some of the stuff that's been coming out of the South lately, which is pretty exciting, or you get British hip hop, you get grime, or now you've got since Nicki Minaj broke like 15 years ago or whenever it was, we're on Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. Now you've got an artist like Flo Milli, who you and I both love, and who we think is just fantastic. Now, granted, there was probably no room for women to, and there were some female MCs back then that were associated with the Zulu Nation and also with Grandmaster Flash, but they weren't as prominent, and they didn't have the stardom ability that they have now. But Flo Milli, with that, the fact that she can get in there and step up, and she's all about competition. She's all about beating back all those hoes,
and bitches. Yeah, she loves to go off on that.
Yes, she does. And on that note, as we always do at the end of these episodes, please become a member of our fabulous Curmudgeonly community on Facebook. A lot of merriment and mirth to be had there. Arturo is continuing to whip out his lists of best albums by year. We just posted
studio albums,
and we just put up our his 1979 list on there. So go check that out. Facebook.com/groups/Curmudgeon Rock. If you have anything to say about our take on the origins of hip hop, anything that you disagree with, anything that you think we didn't put quite right, or things that you loved, write us at curmudgeonrock@gmail.com, and then go visit us on Twitter or X or whatever the hell it's called now. We're still up there. Jason Isbell is still fabulous. Stephen Hyden is still fabulous, and we're fabulous. So please come visit us there. @Curmudgeon Pod is the handle, and also look out for a Spotify playlist, for this episode. To the extent that we can make one, we will.